Who is this handsome old man on the screen? Yeah, that's Aaron. That's our presenter for today. He's a marine conservation scientist. And I shall give you a little bit of introduction to Aaron, which he himself didn't know about himself. Okay. So my association with Aaron started when a long time ago, when I was young and he was even younger. He was probably a teenager when he walked into the dive center sometime in 97, 98 as a skinny, long-haired teenager and said he wanted to dive. So he enrolled, and my earliest memory of chasing him around the dive center, trying to chop off his hair because it drove me completely batty because he could not clear his mask. The hair kept coming in the front. Yeah, so we had a lot of good times in those days. I don't know. When I see people like Aaron and our association that goes back so many years, even though we have not actively been in, it was some of the happiest days that we had at that time. And one more very interesting thing I need to really share with you is that he and his friend, I'm forgetting his name. Aaron, can you help me?
Luke.
Luke, yes, sorry. I'm sorry, my memory is not what it is. So Luke and Aaron, one fine day, decided to catch a cobra, put it in a rucksack, and stuck it on Luke's shoulder while Aaron was driving the two-wheeler. And in the process, Luke actually got bitten by the snake. And then they spent the rest of 1 hour trying to run around, trying to find anti-venom, which they finally found in GMC, I believe. And so Luke is alive and well as well. Okay, so this was some of the various moments that we had to endure, and we felt like parents as well in the process.
Very
Trying to
flattering, Venkat.
chase that. I know it's my job to ridicule you. Now you got a very good image. That's okay, but people need to know what happened in the previous life of yours. Yeah. I'm sure even Anika doesn't know this. Yeah. Okay, so Aaron's two greatest passions, and I think he has maintained that through his teenagers, has been his love for the sea and everything in it, and also what has been on his plate. Both of them have been equally passionate. So he continues to actually have those two passions even today. He was always a naturalist at heart, became a marine conservation scientist by training, and has been a gourmet by aspiration, which he continues to be even now. That said, he tends to see the world through two lenses, nature and food. I don't think I'm wrong in that. I don't think he's interested in anything else, to be very honest with you. Yeah. Thankfully, though, instead of eating seafood indiscriminately, he always thinks about what we eat, where and who produced it, at what cost, and most importantly, how to eat and feed the planet sustainably. And these questions keep him occupied and out of trouble. Right? On completing his PhD from the University of Cambridge in marine conservation science on a full scholarship to him, much to the delight of his long-suffering, despairing parents, he decided to venture beyond academia and has worked on a diverse in the marine conservation domain in many countries and in many contexts. These include understanding the impacts of tropical fisheries on ecosystems and livelihoods, setting up participatory models for management of marine protected areas. And this is something we really need to talk about and focus on, because I would really love to get involved in creating MPAs, at least on the west coast of India. So we have to work together on this, Aaron. Yeah. And setting up of programs for monitoring small scale fisheries. He is currently a member of the IUCN SSC, an advisor on the Seafood Advisory Service called Know Your Fish, which we have also featured here in one of the previous webinars, which gives a lot of information about what seafood to eat during which season, which is very, very important. Uh, Delicate nature of the balance of the oceans now. Yeah. Today, he's one of the proud sons of Goa, and I'm proud of coastal impact, where he's done precious little so far, but I'm gonna hound him now to do even more. Yes, and you can follow him at his handle called MEEN Scientist. Now, for those of you who don't know any South Indian languages, MEEN is fish, right? And that I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Aaron, comes from his time that he spent in Tamil Nadu working with the fishers there for long periods of time. And I don't know, maybe he has misspelled it and maybe it should have been MEAN. You figure it out. All right. So, Aaron, thank you so much for making the time for coming on the webinar. I know you've been quite busy during this lockdown period with training and with all kinds of webinars, but we've finally got you. So, I'm going to hand it over to you and take it away. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Venkat and Karen, for having me over here. And as I said, this is like the most flattery that I'll ever get in the next year for any of the webinars I'll be on. Yeah, so thank you for having me here. So as Venkat said, me and him go back, to 1997, where I was that sort of lanky teenager with long hair, sort of constantly bugging him, coming into his shop. But yeah, we learned a lot during those days, and in many ways, although I've always had a sort of an interest in the sea and in natural history. Venkat sort of really was instrumental in helping me choose my career in many ways, giving me a certain sort of confidences in venturing out into paths that were not really sort of very well researched at that point of time. I remember our first dive was off at Grand Island, and my first day of diving, I had a problem equalizing. This was in '97. It was in November, but we had among the best visibilities at that point of time. And that particular day, I remember, Venkat, we counted like some 13 large Malabar groupers, that were in that wreck. Uh, there was this whole school of barracuda around
Oh, yeah,
us,
I
and
remember that.
it was a very memorable dive, and that will sort of always stay with me. And when Venkat asked me to come and give a talk, I said, I mean, I can talk about issues pertaining to, the whole global seafood trade, seafood sustainability. And he said, no, I'd like you to do something, which was one of your sort of original passions or past loves, which was on sea snakes, and that also was part of my work. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share my screen with you right now. But just to say that this is a really a light collection of images strung together, which basically shows you a path of sorts, but also basically gives you a glimpse as to how one thing led to the other, a sort of a bycatch of sorts, if you think of it. So can you see my screen, everyone? Venkat?
Yes, yeah,
Okay, great,
you're good.
great, fantastic. So it's, what sea snakes taught me about my seafood. And that said, as Venkat has mentioned, I'm part of the IUC and SSC Marine Conservation Committee, which is this 13-member committee, and it is pretty much spread across the globe. And it's really about looking at, at broad patterns, about issues that need to be addressed, about horizon issues that are likely to come up in the near future, whether you talk about large coastal infrastructure or particular nature-based solutions that are kind of, the buzzwords, but also looking at the challenge in this space, which are obviously very many. Today as I speak, there's a whole range of marine ecologists in the country. You wouldn't dream about this, say, even a decade ago. And things are happening at a, at, on one side, the degradation, but on the other side, you're also seeing this whole movement, whether it's coastal impact or a whole range of other NGOs working together. So I think we're at a very important sort of cusp at this moment. So when I talk about when I am getting into my talk about sea snakes, and as you can see this picture, it's basically literally the snakes as they were when the catch was dumped on board of a trawler. You can see the sea snakes with a bit of marine litter there, some plastics, a couple of fish, etc. Um, the reason I got into it was I was doing my master's thesis from this place called the Wildlife Institute of India. It's a premier sort of institution in ecology and wildlife science training. And at that point of time, I mean, I always knew I wanted to do something on reptiles, and I always enjoyed being the sea, diving, fishing, etc. But I never really had, I never really thought that that's going to be literally my 6 month field dissertation, where we really had the luxury of choosing and sort of getting deeply involved in it for those 6 months. So when I decided I wanted to work on sea snakes, the first thought that came to my mind was actually the dives I did with Venkat off Grand Island, and another site at that point of time. And one of the things was I probably saw just one sea snake on those dives. Venkat saw a couple, but not many divers ever saw sea snakes at that site in Grand Island. People do see them occasionally off and on. You go to a site further south, Nethrani, you see more, but you don't see that many on the dives. But it so happened that my uncle, who lives in South Goa, actually owned a trawler. And before this, I remember going on board with him and looking at how the fish was caught, etc. But there was also a couple of snakes caught. But what I was seeing was a large number of sea snakes dead on the coast of Goa every now and then. Like every time I walked between, say, Sinkeri and Baga, I would count like 10 or 15 snakes that were coming in dead. And when I spoke to some of the trawler owners, they said, yeah, we catch them like every day, but they're not that many, but we catch them every single day. So I said maybe that would be the best way to kind of actually look at these creatures. So as you can see, I had really no interest in, actually going into a marine ecology dissertation, but rather it was sea snakes that drove me into this space. Hang on, I'm sorry, I'm not able to go ahead in this presentation. Can you see ahead, Venkat?
Yes, Aaron,
Yeah,
listen.
it's the
Okay,
same slide,
it's
the first
yeah,
one.
it's clear. So the next slide is the one on shrimp trawling. Is that clear?
Yes.
Yeah, now it's okay.
Yeah.
Now it's
Okay.
okay.
Fantastic. So,
Yeah.
as I said, the best way to kind of do that was to accompany trawlers. Now, I had to ask a proper research question, and one of them was like obviously understanding, what were the species of sea snakes being caught at that time. But the other was a very crucial one. Okay, which I'm going to be talking to you in a little while. But a shrimp trawler, for all practical purposes, is a vessel with a net that is dragged behind it, almost shaped like a windsock or a cone. Uh, it basically drags along the sea floor and catches pretty much whatever comes in its path. The reason for this is it targets small species of shrimp like this particular one, which is a species of Metapeneus. That is really small shrimp that you call solar, which is caught like in the early months of August, September. This is the best time. So soon after the closed fishing season opens up, you have this kind of chase for solar. So it's not a very highly prized shrimp, but it's of sufficient value not just for local markets but for distant domestic markets and also for export markets. Now the high value shrimp was tiger shrimp. So if you go back to when trawl started in India, which it did also in many parts of South and Southeast Asia, were the late 50s and the early 60s. Okay, it was a time when obviously it was just soon after independence, and you had a lot of liberalization to kind of open up and to increase foreign exchange earnings. You saw this not just in India, in Sri Lanka, in many parts of Southeast Asia. So it was obviously also sort of supported through various aid agencies, whether it was the Indo-Norwegian project, the FAO, which is the Food and Agricultural Organization, etc. But now they targeted shrimp at that point of time only for the export markets. It was actually called the pink gold rush at that point of time. So, as I said, trawlers would drag their nets along the ocean floor, catching whatever came in their path. Okay, and now this is a little video, which goes back to 2002 when I just started my, my thesis, my field research, and I kind of accompanied these trawlers for literally 6 months. I mean, I would go out on single day voyages, which were like yeah, between 18 to 24 hours, and sometimes smaller. But this was how a typical voyage on one of these trawlers looked. They were really sort of cramped conditions with about 4 to 5 people. I'm just going to play this video. I hope it, yeah, it's got a loud. Yeah, so I'm just going to be speaking behind in the background. So this is a time when the trawler is just starting to fish. Its net is shot out at the back, and you can see it slowly being allowed to be winched out. The two otter boats, those big boats you see on either side, basically sink to the bottom, keep the net at the bottom. You have a combination of floats, which you can see above, and weights below, which actually keep the net mouth open. The whole idea is to have the net mouth open, so it's just dragging like a big creature on the ocean floor. So as I was saying, this is really an old footage. You can see the old river princess in the background in Sinkeri. So this was around 2002, and you can see these fishermen just sort of winching in their catch. The average trawl lasts for about 3 to 3.5 hours. These shrimp trawls were actually banned because they were not very seaworthy. They were, they were these air-cooled engines which basically could not go out very far. So what you saw was sea snakes were being caught. So what this fisherman told me was correct. Several of them were dead because sea snakes are reptiles. They need to surface at regular intervals, and if they're kept submerged, they die. So at that point of time, you could see the people separating the shrimp, the solar shrimp, from the other low-value catch, which was called the bycatch or trash fish, which I'll be speaking a little more about. I used to quickly go about measuring the snakes. This was a short sea snake, also called the shore sea snake. The live ones were marked and released. Okay, the dead ones, I would, you can see me being extremely careless. In those days, there's no antivenom to treat their bites. Not a very smart thing to do. Um, and what you saw was that basically trawlers were trawling for shrimp and a few other species, whether it was, species like threadfin bream, tongue soles, what you call lepo. You had a whole range of these benthic. You had an entire ecosystem. When I talk about it later, you'll see that basically there were over 500 odd species that were being caught by these trawlers. So it was indiscriminate. It was an entire ecosystem. It was as good as, say, dragging a large bulldozer through a tropical evergreen forest, chasing a few squirrels, and you pretty much pick up the entire ecosystem in the process. Over here, you can see like this picture is taken by a colleague of mine, Bivash Pandav, from the east coast of India, where olive ridley turtles come ashore in large numbers just before they lay their eggs. They'll sort of hang around just offshore. But at this point of time, the trawlers are also towing their nets. There are large gill nets that are almost like big curtains that they swim into. So this was kind of exposing me to an issue that was far bigger than the sea snakes. However, despite that, I was super focused at that point. I didn't care what else was dying. I was just looking at the sea snakes, and I was eating great food, very spicy food cooked on board the trawlers, whether it was a spicy, hot, chutney made by my Kannadiga skipper with salt fish to, full squid curries to a whole range of things. So it was an interesting experience because it was anthropological, as well as it was, ecological, studying sea snakes and the other species that were incidentally caught there. So at that point of time, this was 2002, 2003, trawlers pretty much discarded anything else that was not considered valuable for the market, whether it was the domestic market or the distant markets, the export markets. So the shrimp, the squid, the cuttlefish, etc., were all kept. The rest was just shoveled overboard. Now, this was not something that was very particular to India, to Sri Lanka, to Southeast Asia. This was happening globally. Okay. So at that point of time, there was an estimate saying, this was 1997 estimate that said trawlers discarded about 27 million tons of seafood. That was a lot of protein that could have happily gone to feed people that was being chucked overboard. This was a massive problem, not just an ecological crisis because a lot of this stuff was dead, as I showed you pictures of those turtles, etc. But it was also an issue of access, where a lot of this food, which was being caught by the small scale or the artisanal fisher, was now being denied to them in a way because it was being picked up by trawlers and other industrial fisheries and discarded like this. So it was criticized, after which the FAO came up with something called the Code of Conduct for Responsible Fisheries, which said that trawlers should make sure they don't discard and they make better use of their catch. Now, this was all happening at that point of time, and I was like also very critical. Oh, they were discarding so much of stuff, but there was some other patterns that were kind of unfolding around that point of time. My thesis was 6 months. It went off really well, and I'm just going to show you. These are little snapshots, and it's literally like a narrative that I'm going to go into, and y'all can ask me specific questions that y'all may have at the end, whether it's sea snakes or anything else. So at that point of time, now the word for these discards was also, it was a really sort of a lowly word called trash fish. Trash, literally the fish that you would trash overboard. So it was anything that was not valuable to the market or to the export market or even the distant domestic market. A lot of this stuff was, however, very valuable to local coastal communities, to small scale fishers, because it was possibly the only source of protein, besides being a very important source of micronutrients that are not typically available to them. So besides causing an ecological catastrophe, this kind of fishing was also robbing these coastal poor of a very important source of protein and nourishment. So this became a big issue globally. Okay, so I'm going to swing back a bit about sea snakes because Venkat is going to get extremely annoyed if I'm just going to talk about, fish and eating fish. And I promised I won't display a menu card, for this event. So now this is a slide image, really poorly scanned, but it's a picture of the short or the shore sea snake. It used to be the most dominant species of sea snake in Goa and pretty much along the the west coast of India. And it's a pretty common sea snake as you move all the way from India to Australia. So that's kind of where sea snakes occur. They occur all the way from Australia into the east coast of Africa. A few of them have managed to get across, and I'll tell you why. Via via the canals. So this is a short sea snake, and it represents everything when you think of a sea snake. Okay, a sea snake is a snake. Okay, so it is a marine reptile, and in fact, we talk about turtles, but turtles you have like 7 odd species, and sea snakes you have like 65 odd species. So it's a far more speciose group of marine reptiles. In India, we have about 26 odd species, which I'll talk to you about. But this particular sea snake is one of those things they call a true sea snake, a viviparous sea snake. And as you can see, this sea snake is actually lying on the sand. They are really sloppy on the sand because they have kind of lost their ability in a way. Their ventral scales have become almost vestigial because they don't use them that much. Just telling you that they spend pretty much all their time out at sea. They don't have to venture to land for any purpose. Okay, they've got flattened bodies, almost ribbon-shaped, flattened tails. The short sea snake was extremely abundant. I'm talking about the short sea snake because I'm going to come back to it a little later for another reason. Um, Oops, what's something wrong over here? Anyway, so I think some of the pictures are not displaying for some reason. But besides that, they've got these nostrils on the dorsum of their head, right on top, which are valvular. They can actually open and shut the valves. They have to surface at regular intervals to breathe. If not, they die of drowning, just like any other air breathing form, whether it's sea turtles, dolphins, sea snakes. They need to surface to breathe at regular intervals, and fish gear keeps them underwater. Fishing nets keep them underwater, submerged for extended periods, so they drown. Okay, so there's some issue with the slides here. So when I talk about, like, since I'm going into a bit of the sea snake discussion, you have the main group, which is the viviparous sea snake or the true sea snakes. The one over here you can see is probably among the most dominant and common species world over. But this was second to the short sea snake that was the dominant one in Goa and along the west coast for a very long time. Even if you went down south to the Gulf of Mannar, the short sea snake was the dominant one. But today, if you look at it across it is the hook-nosed sea snake that is a dominant one. I say viviparous because they live at sea, they give birth to live young at sea. Um, but then you also have the oviparous sea snakes, that is the ones that lay eggs. In India, you have two species, but globally you have about 8 species. Now, these sea snakes, they venture into sea to hunt for their main prey, which is eels, morays, and conger eels. The females grow much larger than the males, and actually they separate themselves when hunting for eel species, wherein the female snakes go into deeper waters where they're hunting for the larger conger eels, and the males hunt generally in shallow waters. I mean, this was studies that were done in the South Pacific. Where they're very common, and you have a slightly more species. In India, they're only found in the Andaman and Nicobar, and I believe they have been recorded off some of the islands in the northwest of Sri Lanka as well. But you have two species over here. This one is a yellow-lipped sea crate, extremely common in the Andamans. They kind of spend most of their time, hunting in the sea, but then they have to venture onto land to digest their prey. And to lay their eggs. So they are oviparous, unlike the true sea snakes, even though they are both very closely related to land cobras. And they've evolved from an ancestor of land cobras, which was in Australia. Then going to the next group, which are the file snakes. So as I said, both the true sea snakes and the sea kraits are both highly venomous relatives of the cobra. You have the file snake, which is also a kind of marine snake, but it's kind of very differently shaped. They've got like almost, elephant trunk-like body. In fact, one of them, this is the little file snake, that is the one that we get in South Asia, India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. But as you move eastwards, you have another species which gets really thick. It's actually called the elephant trunk snake. And you move towards Australia, you have yet another species. So you have 3 species of file snakes. This one is non-venomous, very similar to other sea snakes. They also have, valvular nostrils. I forgot to mention the first 2 groups also have, salt glands where they're able to excrete excess salt because, like any other snake, they need to kind of maintain that osmotic balance. They need fresh water intake. And then you have another group, which is the mud snakes. So there are there are these several radiations that happened at various paths, for various reasons. But the mud snakes are basically they have close relatives on the land, and they can pretty much live on the land. But this is like the glossy marsh snake, another species that found in mangrove areas. They are predominantly found in the intertidal area, and you can see them if you sort of go out at dawn or at dawn or dusk with a torch. You can actually see them hunting. But what they feed on is they feed exclusively on crabs, and that too crabs that have molted their exoskeleton, so soft shell crabs. And this, along with another one, which we also have here, called the crab-eating snake, as simple as that, for Donia leucobalia, which again occurs from here right up to Australia. Both these species can actually feed on crustaceans, but then they can actually break their prey and eat them part by part. They're the only snakes in the world that are known to do that, except those captive bred snakes where you can actually feed them. They feed them baby mice, and you have these pinky presses where you put little baby mice and you just sort of squeeze the liquid into their esophagus. I mean, quite quite cruel things to do, but I mean, that's the pet industry for you. So here you have the glossy marsh snake. But besides that, you also have a couple of other species. You have 8 other species across the world of this group called the mud snakes that have adapted to a marine existence. In India, we have about 4 of them. Okay, the most common one being the dog-faced water snake, which is found again pretty much from here right up to Australia. And this is just to give you an idea of how big these creatures can go. That's me probably not eating enough. This is way back in the Gulf of Mannar, 2004, and that's a very large yellow sea snake, or Hydrophis spiralis. You rarely see these giants anymore. So after I did this work in Goa, I sort of extended it. I went down to the Gulf of Mannar along the southeast coast of India, and I said, I want to continue with this research. And one thing was that was quite striking was that just the numbers I was getting in the nets were way fewer than what I was seeing as bycatch in Goa, and that was kind of a bit startling. It was interesting that I found actually more species out there. In Goa, I had about six odd species, including the mud snakes, whereas in the Gulf of Mannar there were like 10 odd species. But their catch rates were just way too low. And when I actually interviewed fishermen and spoke to them, they used to catch a lot more in the past. And if you go to neighboring Sri Lanka, which also shares the Gulf of Mannar with India and parts of the Park Bay, you see that catch rates are way higher from actually workers in that region. So it is a clear indication that fishing has a big role in driving these populations, many of them to local extinction, and many of them we don't even know because we aren't monitoring them. And this is with many groups of bycatch, whether it's with sea snakes. Sea turtles have got like a way more turtle biologists working on them than you actually have sea snake biologists. Or with sharks, rays, etc. The lesser known ones. The big sharks obviously are well studied, but like the lesser known rays, the little electric ray, etc., really don't know what's going on. Many of these species are very long lived. Many of them take, like this particular one will take about 3.5 years to reach sexual maturity, only after which it can actually breed. Now, if a trawler sort of drags its net in a particular area, particularly in these enclosed bay areas where they kind of come over to kind of either mate or breed, you can actually locally exterminate a population. This is what's happened in many parts of the world. Over years, sea snakes are not targeted for food or for flesh or for skin, but in many parts of Southeast Asia, like in Thailand, they actually use squid lights, and because now the profits from squid is so low, they actually use this bycatch as a high value commercial catch. Same in Philippines is an island. I've actually visited. It's called Gato Island, and or Gato Island. It's named after like a cat or whatever. And basically over there, there were so many snakes, but hookah divers itself managed to exterminate the population of sea kraits out there. So it's possible, even though you might see creatures very abundant at one point of time, they have not adapted to these very industrial methods that we have today. The only predator that a species like this would have are the white-bellied seagulls that fly above, or maybe large sharks, large fish like cobia, etc., that would feed on them. But besides that, they hold a very sort of upper trophic role, so they have a very important role in ecosystem function. So I'm going to move ahead. So when I talk about bycatch, it's not just sea snakes and sea turtles. What trawlers and what fishing exposed me to was a whole array of other species that were being caught and killed. Now, as we speak, there's this ocean stranding network in Goa that's kind of being run by Terra Conscious, the Drishti Marine Lifeguard Service, the Goa Forest Department, that between 2017 and 2020 had 273 strandings of small marine mammals and turtle bycatch. Now this is quite a lot of dead animals. I mean, this is both dead and live animals, but this is quite a lot of creatures that are just floating ashore. And now you have this network that is actually able to tell you that this many creatures are coming ashore, and they've got, many of them have got net marks, some of them have got propeller marks. So you can see that fishing has got a disproportionate impact on their populations than they would actually see, but than they would actually see naturally. That's what I meant. Now the thing is, it wasn't just these endangered species that were being caught. So as I spoke about it, it was what began to interest me as I sort of went along the coast. I moved from the Gulf of Mannar. The tsunami struck. It so happened I was out in a trawler on that night, but I didn't feel a thing because I was probably, we just rode the wave. But when we got back, we heard there was total chaos everywhere. And I sort of potted around the coast. I began, soon after the tsunami, I began working on a project with the UNDP. This was the Post Tsunami Environment Initiative project, and I was kind of heading the fisheries component at that point of time. And we first conducted these baseline surveys, but at the end, I kind of focused on the Coromandel coast, that is the stretch of coast, straight along the east, pretty much the eastern side in the Bay of Bengal between Chennai and Kodiakarai. Now, this area is got like, it's also one of the areas where one of the first trawlers were introduced way back in the late 1950s, actually early 1960s, there, and in a place called Mandapam, which was part of the Gulf of Mannar. Now, this is an image from a port in Nagapattinam at a time when catch was just being landed. So now I'm moving off from the sea snake discussion to more on the broader trends of fishing and fisheries. So you see here, this is a time when the fish catch is just landed. This is something you'll see at pretty much any fish landing site, whether a large fish landing site, whether it's Kasimeda in Chennai, or you go down to Nagapattinam or Sassoon Dock in Mumbai, to certain large fish landing sites in Sri Lanka like Negombo. This is a picture portrait of what you would see at a fish landing site, and this is where I used to spend most of my life, post the sea snake work. It was generally, people said, oh wow, you're a marine ecologist, you're doing all these this fancy work, going to these beautiful places. I say no, I'm generally working at these really sort of stinking harbors and measuring a lot of dead, decomposing fish on a daily scale. So this is a time when the fish has just come in, and I'm playing this little video for you again. And what you can see here, there is a lot of madness, but there's a lot of order in this madness. And this is a time when the catch comes in. You can see the high value commercial catch has already been sent out. It's been it's being held there, where these big companies come, they take the shrimp, the cuttlefish, and all the others. The other stuff that you're seeing coming in now is stuff that's being sold in the markets. The rays, these are many of them are probably threatened, and many of them are possibly locally extinct in many parts, because you don't see them in numbers that you would do before, were being caught in these operations. I told you about the time when trawlers were discarding their catch. This trash fish was now being landed by the ton. Okay, so that was in 2002. This was in 2006. So literally, you were getting heaps and heaps of this trash fish being landed every day at these various fish landing sites. Now, this is a place just outside that village. It's called Akrapetai, where they're literally drying tons of trash fish every day. Many of these were old agricultural lands as well, and because of the tsunami, many of them were rendered infertile, because they were like highly salinized, and this trash fish was being dried here. So it was being dried in a very sort of a rudimentary fashion. It was under the heat of the sun. It was decomposing. As I said, a lot of this so-called trash fish, was very important fish, not just for the ecology and the ecosystem, but for coastal communities that depended on fish, especially these small fish, as a very important source of protein and nutrition. Here it was being dried and in a semi-decomposed state, because these trawlers would go anywhere from 1 to 3 days. In Chennai, they would go right out for like 7 days. And this is the trend you see not just in Chennai, but it was happening in Goa, which wasn't happening when I was around. And it was happening in many other parts of India. Not just there, it was happening in many parts of the world. Now, you remember I mentioned to you about this stat of 27 million tons of discards made by this estimate in 1997. There was another recent estimate soon after that. I think it was published around 2000 and around 2004-5, and basically it said that the landings, the fish landings and the discards have definitely decreased, and they were landing more fish, keeping with the FAO code for responsible fisheries. But where was all this low value um, fish meal or trash going? So if I followed these guys back, what it was showing me was that a lot of this was just being fed to poultry industries, many of which were located in in parts of the central part of the Indian peninsula, whether it was Chittoor in Andhra Pradesh, Namakkal in in Tamil Nadu itself, and you go to these areas, which have no sea next to them, and you can actually smell the sea, and you can smell huge quantities of seafood because it's being dried by the ton there. It's literally being sort of dried. It's ground. It's mixed with other, various other food components, whether it's soy meal, grain, oil cakes, or whatever, and it's fed to chickens. Now, the chicken industry was growing very much like the industrial fishing industry. They were both big industries in the country. And again, not here. This trend was like in that region. You see this trend happening in you see this trend happening in Bangladesh and in other parts of Southeast Asia. You could see large mechanized trawlers being knocked out in many parts where they're not allowed, in many parts of the world. Like Indonesia banned trawling for a while, Philippines banned trawling, but now Indonesia has apparently reopened certain kinds of drag netting, which is unfortunate because this is a kind of fishing that's annihilation. It takes everything in its path. Okay, so as I said, it was not just chickens that were being fed. Fish was being used to feed farmed fish. So like to make a kilo of say Asian sea bass, what you call sonak in Konkani or betki, you need to feed it approximately 8 to 9 kilos of trash fish or fish meal made from other fish. So as we speak, it's not just trash fish because trash fish is considered very low quality. There are dedicated boats, there are dedicated uh, purse seining boats, which are boats that target shoaling pelagics like sardine, etc., which encircle shoals of fish and they bring it back. Sardine and all these small fish are extremely important source of protein, highly nutritious because they're lower down the food web, and they are actually so they're very beneficial to coastal community. It was literally being taken to the fish meal industry. As we speak, many of these fisheries have actually seen very drastic declines in many of these parts, not just here. I can tell you the same story for Peru with the anchoveta fishery that pretty much accounts for the major proportion of global catch, which was being just dedicated fisheries going out targeting bulk catching these fish to be ground for fish meal for fish, pigs, and chickens. So a lot of the seafood that was supposed to be destined to human consumption was going to feed animals, and it was not efficient. As I told you, like to kind of grow species like croaker or to grow species like Asian sea bass or cobia, which is your mordsaw, you need to feed them a lot more fish meal. So it's definitely non-economical in the long run and and also it's definitely not not ecological. It's an ecological disaster, and it's threatening a whole range of endangered species, but it's also beginning to threaten livelihoods. All our pets are being fed with these various these pet food, which is quite a big and growing industry. And again, it's heavily dependent on wild caught fish. This is not fish that's been planted by you. We treat fish like it's a crop. They call it a crop very often. And if you look at it, our fisheries department is under the Ministry of Agriculture. Again, it's not particular to this place. It's also seen in many other parts, and it's production oriented. As I as I can, and dogs are eating healthy too. You're getting sea biscuits with omega 3. So you have this entire industry which is targeted to reduction fisheries, and this is a big problem. As I said, it's not just an ecological catastrophe, it's a problem for sustainable seafood, but it's also a problem, it's also a problem of equity, wherein poor marginal people are not getting access to uh, possibly the only sole source of protein they can. Okay, and so why have we come to this position? If you look at it, we live on a very very blue, very watery planet with more than 70% of the Earth's surface, you know, um, basically covered by water. And actually, it's a very watery planet. But typically, we are largely landlubbers. And if you look at it, most of our land space is owned, managed, and controlled in some form or the other. You can't just go and decide you're going to be tilling the land and planting a crop any way you like. I mean, even though people do it illegally, you can't do that. But when you look at the sea, it's pretty much open access. To particular zones. You can't go into another country's waters, even though that's happening almost regularly. Now you can see these small little boats just off the coast, just off the west coast of Sri Lanka and Kalpitia, wherein they are actually trawling. They are using these small boats, but they're trawling the nearshore waters. So this is what's happening as well. Very often we see the small fish as the small fish as the good guys, the industrial ones as the bad guys. But to kind of make ends meet, or to kind of like just survive in many cases, many of these small guys have actually had to use very destructive means. And that's what happens as the environment gets degraded. You have to use more destructive means to kind of sustain livelihood. So this is a big problem, and it's one that boils down to our resilience. And this comes to particular light as I'm speaking, particularly in the at the time of the COVID pandemic, wherein uh, I suddenly see people taking a very keen interest in angling, or even agriculture. You're seeing our fields being tilled more often. But how do we get our seas back to the former glory? And why have we come here? If we look at it, if I show you a picture like this, and I've showed this many times over, this is a picture taken by a friend of mine in the northeast, and in Arunachal Pradesh. And basically, he said that the head was given to the chief of this particular tribe. But I mean, a lot of it would be looked at as poaching and whatever else. But when we see this Malabar grouper, which is a fairly common sight if you went to the Mali fish jetty, or you went to any other part, um, you'd probably just think of this. And with that, I'm just going to end with a little note. So what happened to the sea snakes then? So when we talk about those two species, I said the short sea snake, which was dominant, it took up nearly 70% of the catch rate of what I was catching in 2002 and 2003, whereas the other one, the hook-nosed sea snake or the beak sea snake, was the rest of the 30%, and the others made a very tiny percentage. So it was these two that were the dominant species. What's happened now? So we've had another study that was conducted somewhere in 2009, and recently colleagues of mine a little further up the coast conducted another study, and they found that the short sea snake, which was this abundant one, is become extremely rare. It was almost knocked out. They barely caught any. It was the next most abundant one. But what we showed, and basically what our data showed, was basically that fishing, the increase in fishing and sustained trawl fishing in a particular area is actually led to this flip over, wherein one species which was more susceptible for various reasons, we found that the short sea snake was more prone to trawl related mortality. It was dying much easier. It was a much more sensitive species, whereas the beak sea snake was able to migrate into rivers. It was found up the Mandovi. It was able to come out. It was much more resilient to fishing pressure, and it seems to have been the case in many other parts. So what we saw was this kind of flip over of these two. So one became more dominant, and it was a very clear case wherein wherein fishing can actually drive declines, can actually drive changes in the community, in the ecological community. So basically, you think that by stopping fishing tomorrow, you're going to get back to the former glory. You might never be able to get back to the former glory. It's like sort of saying when you clear fell a forest, what you get back is not those old growth trees, but very often you just get a very weedy community, which is characterized by stuff that just smothers the area and doesn't let anything else grow. And that's what we are seeing with many of our soft bottom communities, that is at the sea floor in many parts of the world. So I was involved. I'm also part of the IUCN Sea Snake Specialist Group, and I was involved with an assessment way back in 2009. That was possibly the only assessment that was done for sea snakes, and we ran this for about 69 species. A bunch of us, sat together, and based on literature or based on direct observations, we kind of graded the species on the different categories that IUCN has. And what we found out that most of them were in the data deficient category, nearly 34%, and many of them were just thrown into the least concern category. Whereas very few that we knew were in the critically endangered, just two species basically. So and they were found in Australia, and the only reason for that we could possibly say is that a lot more studies, a lot more work had been done there to kind of say that this species has been knocked off because of coral bleaching or whatever else. But we could not say the same here. It's just because we didn't have that knowledge. And just imagine, besides the sea snake, what's happening to the cetaceans and to a whole multitude of marine organisms that live along the seafloor. Now, as I say, a lot of these trawlers are running on empty. Many of them are struggling to keep afloat. They're using lights today, and basically people are saying, oh, they're using lights, but what they're doing is they're just trying to stay afloat, to stay economically profitable. Many of them are venturing out of the trawling fleet into using large gill nets to catch, high value fish like tuna, etc. But that itself is not going to be lasting too long unless strict controls are put in place. Um, so with that, I'd like to sort of end this, but I would be very happy to sort of take this discussion further. And if there are any other questions, I'll be more than happy to take them. But this was a kind of a very broad picture that I gave you all. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. That was really informative, but also I would say very disturbing to hear. I mean, we do know broadly. I mean, I'm talking about laypersons like me who are not scientists. We do hear about the state of the oceans and what terrible calamities have happened on it already. In many cases, as you correctly said, it might be irreversible. But to actually get numbers thrown in your face and to know it from personal experience from somebody you do know personally is, I think, very, very disturbing. I still remember the times when we used to go out diving. We used to see trawlers coming back with, really low in the water with the same species of fish. But now you hardly find that. The trawlers are half empty and they come with various species of fish, much smaller in size, and a huge mix of that, which itself is an indication about, overfishing being a huge problem. I
Yep.
don't know where the story ends. And to be
Yeah.
very honest, I don't think I'm being a pessimist. I would say I'm being a realist in the situation that humanity is gonna face when your kids grow up. I think it's gonna be a whole different picture. I would
Yeah.
like to think otherwise, but I don't know. What do you feel?
Yeah, I think what we are facing right now is not just, like many of the issues that we face right now, is not just one thing. It's like a convergence, it's a catastrophic convergence of many things.
Yes.
So a couple of years ago, a bunch of scientists, not just in NIO but a few other countries, they kind of showed us this massive dead zone in the Bay of Bengal, and also there was one more sort of building up in the Arabian Sea. And what you're seeing was a dead zone, which is a zone that is pretty low in oxygen levels. It's a area of hypoxia, and what you're seeing is these zones are increasing in size. And it's not just because of overfishing, but it's overfishing coupled with land-based activities, highly polluting activities, which may also come from our food production systems, like intensive agriculture that uses a huge amount of nitrate pesticides that flow into the ocean, pollute the ocean. So it's basically stuff that you do in one environment affects the other. Like we have like these oil globules on Goa's beaches every year, which are believed to come from somewhere up in Bombay High. So the thing is, these are very big regional issues. So today, a lot of the, like I keep telling this story, but a lot of the fish that we see in Goan markets, even though Goans want fresh fish, etc., a lot of it is basically stock held in various sort of freezer areas, and it's coming from other coasts. You know what I'm saying? There was a time we were even importing, this our surmai, a version of our surmai, which is another Scombero morris that's found somewhere in the East Sea of Korea, being sold as surmai here because the catches were lower in some other parts. Kerala was importing from another part. We've had crashes in sardines, which is actually very difficult. These are things that don't happen that easily because these are species that have this very short life, but they lay thousands of eggs, and basically they are found in large schools. But if you use industrial operations like a purse seiner, which actually encompasses an entire school of fish, all of them gravid at a particular point of time, you can actually deplete catches. Now, so what we are seeing is a catastrophic convergence of of kind, basically, on land and at sea, whether it's in our rivers. So thankfully the rivers in particularly along the west coast, we don't have any industrial fishing. It's all small scale artisanal in nature, but we have other land based polluting activities that we have to be sort of aware of.
Okay. So right now, I'm going into the garage and getting a shovel, and I'm digging myself a 6 foot hole,
Oh gosh, oh my
lying
god.
down in it and covering myself up. And that's with my limited knowledge of what is happening.
Yeah, but I
How
mean,
do
I've got
you
to tell
how do
you.
you live with that?
No, so yeah, I shouldn't be such a, I mean, I don't know why. I was probably, gave so many webinars that I've become this doom and gloom guy. But just to be very frank with you, we are also seeing a few bright spots, pretty much around, in several parts of the world, as we would expect in many parts of the Northwest Pacific, in parts of Europe. I mean, don't get me wrong. I mean, many parts of Europe and, the Pacific and the Atlantic have managed to collapse many of their fish stocks, but you're seeing many of these regions recover. The thing
Mm-hmm.
is, in a tropical ecosystem, it's kind of slightly different. We don't just have cod, haddock, plaice, and saithe. We've got a bunch of other species. As I said, we catch like hundreds of other species. So it's not
Mm-hmm.
just those few. I could say tomorrow that I can go out just targeting this particular threadfin bream and I won't catch anything. That's not going to happen. We live in a very diverse environment. Tropical environments are very diverse. So when we catch something, there's a huge fallout. But what we are seeing, we are seeing positive notes in various parts, whether it is, increase in, say, mangrove cover, like in Sri Lanka, and in many parts of India, even in Goa, you're seeing increase in mangrove cover. There are many cases where there is co-management, wherein in many cases you see the traditional knowledge systems are being lost to kind of state-held ones. Wherein the fisheries department says, I know what I'm doing. This is how you manage stuff. This is how we'll control the number of people. But in traditional managed systems, you have a lot of complexity involved, and what you're seeing now is a lot of co-management happening, whether it's happening in the South Pacific, whether it's happening in in parts of Southeast Asia. You're seeing it along the coast of East Africa and Tanzania. You're seeing it in many parts. You're seeing these few examples, and what we need to do, it's to scale this up. But obviously, scaling this up is not going to happen because there is local complexity to each case. So obviously, scan globally and locally, but reinvent locally.
Yeah, no one solution fits all. So
Yeah.
it
But
has
you
to
need to
be
scan. You need to know what's going on elsewhere
sure,
to
sure.
come up with good solutions.
All right, great. Okay, Nishta, sorry, has got a question. Says, what would you suggest could be done to the unwanted catch?
Um, so, so the unwanted catch is definitely an issue. As I said, discarding it is a problem, but also landing it and feeding it to chickens is a problem. So the answer here is trawling is a bulk but a low quality kind of fishing. We need to improve the numbers of quality fishing that we practice, which is fisheries that are more specific. That said, trawling needs to be phased out slowly because it's definitely it's not going to happen that easily because it's also a big contributor of our seafood, you know. But things like reduction fisheries, that is fishing for fish meal to feed chickens, fish, and pigs, that's definitely got to go. You know what I'm saying? We've got to look at alternatives, and we are seeing this happen. Aquaculture has got to be a big part of the solution, wherein and it's going to happen. Basically, right now, aquaculture contributes to about 47% of the total seafood we consume, China being the biggest driver for that. The issue over there is aquaculture just focuses on a few species compared to what you catch in the wild. And they tend to focus on, either species like shrimp, which are highly destructive to the environment, or species that are up the food web that require a lot of wild caught species to feed them. So it doesn't make sense. But you can turn the tide, and you're seeing that happening even in neighboring countries like Bangladesh, which are doing some really fascinating pieces of work, wherein they use like to make a pond nutritionally sensitive. Say they are adding, the smaller indigenous species of fish that the locals would consume. So yes, you can have your big carp that fetches you a good price, which is vegetarian. Okay, but you also have the smaller indigenous species, which is very important for the diets particularly of marginalized communities. Okay, Nishita, I hope I've answered your question in a roundabout manner.
One more question from Siddharth Raju. From what little I know about terrestrial snakes, after consuming a sizable meal, they don't move about much. In the case of sea snakes, which need to constantly surface to air for air, sorry, is there a difference in digestion mechanism?
Yeah, so when I was talking about the sea kraits, if you remember, the sea kraits go and feed on these massive moray eels, and then they come to shore to kind of digest them. So you can see I mean, the eel will be in the body for a couple of days, and what the sea krait does, it just goes under a pile of rocks or into a mangrove hollow and just rests there for like up to a week sometimes. And I know this because you can actually hold a sea krait upside down, and the eels are so heavy they would just regurgitate the whole thing. That was a
My
way when
God.
we are like kind of looking at diet of sea snakes, you know. I mean, so
Okay.
this is what we have to do sometimes. But that said, with the true sea snakes, many of them just come to the surface, and they just lay at the surface for extended periods. Many of that happens along sea slicks, where two currents meet, the warm and cold currents, and then you have a lot of like marine algae, seaweed, lots of eggs. They are high productive zones, and you also have sea snakes floating in there. And you sometimes see large congregations in particular parts. There's a beautiful note by a person called Lau in the Straits of Malacca, where he saw this line that went on for kilometers, and it was half a kilometer wide, I think, and it was of
Jeez.
this one species that is pretty much non-existent. It's the largest species of sea snake called the Stokes sea snake. You don't see them in that except in Australia and a few other parts. So
Wow.
yes, they just kind of take it easy. They rest at the surface. Sea kraits kind of digest and show. The mud snakes, obviously, they can they kind of go into a burrow, like the dogface water snake just go into a burrow and they kind of hang around there till they digest and then they move out again.
One more question from Sid. Snakes are supposed to be cold blooded creatures. How do sea snakes manage their body temperature given how quickly you can lose heat in water? And they don't seem to have much fat.
Yeah, no, actually, so they can have quite a lot of adipose fat, but what's interesting is which I should have mentioned is that the distribution of sea snakes is circumtropical. It only occurs as a tropical band, much like mangroves, much like corals, with the highest diversity being towards towards Philippines, Australia, that has the highest diversity, and it decreases as you move westwards. Very similar to the diversity of coral fish, very similar to the diversity of corals, and also to to mangroves. Now, mangroves, you have many species along the on the east side of India and fewer along the west. Now, if you went to the Red Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, etc., you don't have sea snakes, except one sea snake, which is called it's called Hydrophis platurus, the yellow-bellied sea snake, and it's one that everyone knows. It's got a very long snout. I should have put a picture there, and it just floats on sea slicks. And it actually managed to get across the canal, and it's now also on the other side. And you find it in parts of Costa Rica as well, where they actually sort of, they don't have any predators, over there, so they're just increasing in numbers. And that's how it's, through the Suez Canal. There's also been a lot of Lesseps migrants, as they call them, rabbit fish and a whole bunch of others that now constitute the major fisheries, having depleted local fisheries in that area.
It's very interesting. No passport controls, no border controls, obviously, for the snakes.
Uh,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. Or
Okay.
snakes, fish, and fishermen, they just follow the fish, and that's how it
That's
happens
right. Yeah.
basically.
Yeah. Anita George, question for you. Good to see you and hear from you. Thanks. I've communicated with you regarding sea snakes of Goa. When I joined NIO, the first story was the hydrophis species, landed as bycatch in Karanzalem. The same species I found during my JCU Australia. What is your suggestion for seafood after studying sea snakes for all these years?
Yeah, my suggestions, which I didn't go into the depths of it, because I was forewarned, is basically I think seafood is a big answer, and the way we consume it is a big answer to some of the crisis we face in the sector. Very often, the answer of like just banning is definitely not the way to go. But like as I was talking about, like for example, fisheries that happen in channels. There's always going to be any kind of food producing industry is going to always have a certain level of a negative fallout. It's basically how much, what is the trade-off we are willing to accept. This is something that we need to ask. And definitely industrial fisheries that disturbs and destroys long-term sustainability is not the way to go for sure. But there are better answers in the way we catch fish. Now we go to like some parts of northwest Sri Lanka where they're fishing for even high value tuna like yellowfin, etc., using long lines but not too long. And you also have the big long liners as well, but they have also fairly low levels of bycatch compared to these big large gill nets that just float for miles along the ocean floor, catching sharks, catching whatever else. So there, you can tell people not to land sharks, it's endangered, or not to land turtles, they're endangered, but when they're caught dead, it doesn't make a difference. So with regards to your second part of your question, which is the species found there, yes, Hydrophis schistosus, which was originally called Anhydrina schistosus, is also found all across here, right up to Australia. But you also have another species which was found just off, Townsville, somewhere in the area just off there. Basically, it's called Anhydrina zweifeli, and up in Weipa and the Gulf of Carpentaria. So you have two species of this so-called Anhydrina, which is now Hydrophis schistosus. But so to answer your question there, it's also the sea snake from which you can use the monovalent to treat other sea snake bites, monovalent antivenom, which is not manufactured in India, by the way. So if you get bitten, you could be in trouble. And but the thing is, the bites are fairly rare. I know of a couple of tourists, but I know of several fishermen who've got bitten. Some survived, some died.
Oh, okay. Tushar has got a question. Is it challenging to identify a sea snake to species level on the field?
Uh, yeah, I mean, some of them are pretty straightforward, but otherwise they're all very similar in terms they're all banded. Okay, as I said, India has got 18 of those viviparous sea snakes, two sea kraits, and a bunch of those mud snakes. But otherwise, you need to key them down. You need to key them down by basically counting the scales, the maxillary teeth, and there are a few other taxonomic characters basically. But yeah, there is a monograph of sea snake that still is kind of like. Is still the reference that you need to go to because it talks about the holotype specimens that many of them, very interestingly. So just to kind of digress a bit, the beak sea snake or the hook nose sea snake, the holotype specimen was collected from Trankaba, Tarangambadi on the east coast, which is now in the collections of the Natural History Museum. So I went there and actually, got to see it. It was quite amazing, particularly having worked in Trankaba, and there's literally nothing there now.
Sad. But it's going to be a bit tough for me to, if I'm diving and I come across a sea snake, to go grab onto it and then count the scales and look into the mouth.
Yeah,
Not recommended.
you do it with either with dead snakes or museum specimens, or
Hmm.
some of them have got a very clear character. Like for example, the beak sea snake has got this enlarged rostral beak or the
Right.
enlarged rostral scale. That's why it's called the beak sea snake or the
Hmm.
hook nose sea snake. So some of them are very sort of definitive, like the yellow bellied sea snake which just floats around. It's got a very prominent long face and yellow belly.
Okay.
But yeah, and the taxonomy keeps playing around a bit, but broadly, at least to species level, you can. But as I said, you have about 67 odd species, between here and Australia. Of the viviparous sea snakes, 8 of the egg-laying ones, and another, 35 odd mud snakes, of which 8 are marine.
Right. Okay, Karan has got a question. What kind of strategy can one resort to in order to phase trawling out? Considering thousands of jobs associated with its existing supply chain, people compelled to daily wages in order to sustain livelihoods. Is there a one solution for all type of approach?
Definitely not. I mean, that's a very important question, and there's definitely no one size fits all. Even if you look at the socio-economic background of trawler owners, there are some who own multiple businesses. Like, for example, when trawling started in Tamil Nadu and Andhra as well, you have people who are even actors that first went into owning trawlers because they had extra spare change to kind of invest in, fishing, and they kind of immediately reap the benefits. Really, fishermen didn't venture into it. They're very like sort of reticent about it because they didn't know how it's going to. They looked at these things as new sort of monsters in a way. You know what I'm saying? Until they learned from others that they can make a good amount of profit. So that's how, whether it's good practice or bad practice, it can go from place to place. But a very interesting question, because if you look at the fleet in Goa, pretty much, and the crew on the fleet in Goa, okay, pretty much 90% of all the crew working on trawlers and purse seiners and the big industrial fisheries are not people from the state. So it's not generating jobs over here, but a lot of them don't even come from from the fishing industry. Many of them have come from the failed agricultural sector in drought prone areas of Tamil Nadu and Andhra Pradesh. Like a lot of them from Srikakulam district are migrating to Gujarat because there's less work there. So yes, it's going to put quite a few jobs out. But if you look at the trawling sector, each trawler, as I said, employs about 4 to 6 people. This is the ones that drag the net. Purse seiners obviously far higher, but the artisanal sector, the small scale sector, employs a much larger proportion of the country's fishermen. This is something that we need to understand. So if we are looking at food for human consumption, we really need to incentivize good practice fishing, and there has to, ways to phase it out. You'll really have to look at the socio-economic background. And I said, states like Tamil Nadu have already started doing it. But the thing is, they're looking at answers in long line fishing and distant water fishing, which is also quite complex actually, or in, industrial aquaculture. So, I hope I've sort of, dealt with your question in a bit.
No easy answers, unfortunately, for us.
Yeah, but it's one size doesn't fit all.
Yeah,
As Tushar said, it's right. Yeah.
yeah. So I think we've run out of questions here, but there is, sorry, wait a minute. There's one more which has come on now. Lisa says, I've seen pictures of a crab with a yellow-lipped sea crate in its pincers in the Andamans. Is this a likely defense mechanism of the crab, or do they feed on predators as well?
Yeah, that's very possible. So a weak, yellow-bellied sea snake that's either very tired of, swimming or whatever else, or it's injured in some way, could be predated upon by these large, in the Andamans you have lots of these cardiosoma, these land crabs that come out. Yeah, I've seen them catch lots of mud snakes as well and eat them. And you see this, so you have a few predators. Sea snakes do have predators. As I said, one of the main ones is the white-bellied seagull. So if you stand below the nest of a white-bellied seagull, the young very often regurgitate, sea snakes, and they're quite incredible the way they fish them, But and it's possible that the sea snake can actually kill a white-bellied seagull, but they've got these really thick scales, and they manage to grab the head quite fast and impair them, So you can see them fishing if you go to the Andamans. Even in Goa, we see them diving off and on and catching snakes, but they
Yeah.
do have predators, big fish, and seagulls.
So there is an observation by Fatima, not really a question. Thank you for this informative lecture. Personally, I have met up with dead sea snakes while field surveys in fish landing sites in north and east coast of Sri Lanka. And from most of them are from the coastal fishing techniques.
Yeah,
Okay, so that's just observation.
yeah. There's
There are questions, and unless anybody else has got anything more to add, I think we've covered it all. Thanks, Aaron, again,
my pleasure, Venkat. It
for
was
taking the time. And thanks to SSI and also all the participants. There's still 20 hanging there. So that's a good number. Yeah. And yeah, let's hope we stay in touch, and we'll try and do some more projects together.
definitely, yeah. And no, thank you for hosting this and inviting me, Venkat.
Not at
Yeah,
all.
it means a lot, just to keep the legacy going. And by the way, the snake that you spoke about wasn't a cobra; it was a Russell's viper.
Yes, I know.
And we didn't
Karen
have a bag
corrected
at that
me.
point, unfortunately, And it happened a long time ago, by the way,
That's
since I'm on
right.
record now. Yeah,
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
yeah. Okay,
Great.
thank you,
All
SSI,
right.
Venkat, Karen.
Take
Bye.
care.
Yeah,
Good
have a
night.
good evening. See you.
Good night.